Okay, Richard, shall we say over to you. Richard Corbett, you can please, for those few of us who don't know a lot about you or know you personally, do say who you are, what you were, and what you're going to be. And also tell us all about the European political community, about which personally I know very little. So please, good evening, Richard.
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me along. It's nice to see some old friends and faces on the screen. As you asked me to say who I was, well, I was one of Yorkshire and Humber's members of the European Parliament. I was the Labour Party leader in the European Parliament for a number of years. And I am actually at this moment in Brussels because I have been doing, though it's now just finishing, some work for the European Parliament that asked me to represent it, surprisingly, as a Brit, to represent it in the unit that was organising this conference on the future of Europe that has just finished. So I guess that's why you asked me to speak, on the theory that I have my finger on the pulse of what's happening in Brussels. Though whether I really know much more than anybody else is anybody's guess, really. But the subject you asked me to speak on is this new, interesting but curious thing called the European political community. An idea that was originally pushed by Macron, the President of France, to have a venue for bringing together not just the 27 member states of the European Union, but other countries in Europe. And indeed, at its first meeting 3 weeks ago in Prague, there were some 44 countries who took part at the level of their prime ministers or presidents, plus the leaders of the European institutions. That effectively means virtually every country in Europe, bar Russia and Belarus. So it was a significant event, and it will continue to meet regularly. It was agreed every 6 months. The next meeting will be in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, right next to Ukraine. The one afterwards in Spain, and the one after that in the United Kingdom, at a venue still to be determined in a year and a half from now. I suppose we can at least say that there is perhaps one thing that we might agree is perhaps the only thing, I don't know, that Liz Truss has done right, which was to actually turn up to this on behalf of the United Kingdom, because of course that was in doubt as well, with the plenty of people in her party who said, no, don't go anywhere near something like this. But this is important in one way, but not significant in another way. It's a summit. It has not created any institutions. It cannot take legally enforceable or binding decisions. Its participants are quite diverse economically and politically, doesn't have the cohesion, relative cohesion that the European Union does. There are some significant divergences in points of view on the issues that could be, or well, certainly those that were discussed at this meeting. So it's not got the potential to develop into a new European Union or a looser second tier of the European Union. It's a very loose structure. So loose that it's not even made use of the existing structure of the Council of Europe, this body that was set up after the war, which now actually has all those countries as members of it, especially as Russia has been thrown out of it. And it could have been billed as a summit meeting of the Council of Europe, which does at least have institutions and a structure and a permanent set of offices, and indeed some legal competences in the field of human rights. But this was kept separate from that. Some indeed are suspicious of it as a way of keeping aspirant member states of the European Union in the Western Balkans and in Ukraine to to fob them off with this forum where they can discuss with the EU without actually joining it. Others say, no, it's not about that. It's without prejudice to their attempts to join the European Union. Indeed, it might help that because we will be meeting them more regularly, and they can have extra opportunities to discuss with us and so on. It does not hold up enlargement of the EU to the Western Balkans or in due course to Ukraine. It's not a way of fobbing them off. There are different views as to whether that is an accurate description of the intentions or not. I dare say intentions vary from one actor to another on that. So that being said, it's not a new significant structure with legal or political powers. It's not got any institutions or permanent secretariat. Nonetheless, it was important. For a start, just bringing together 44 countries, virtually every country in Europe other than Russia and Belarus, together at the head of government level or president level, head of state level, in one place to do a family photo together saying we stand together in the face of what has just been happening in Russia and Ukraine. That is politically very significant. It was a way of all the democratic countries of Europe to say we stand together in these difficult times. It was also a networking opportunity for bilateral discussions on the margins of the meeting. Britain and France had a bilateral meeting, which may perhaps, we will see, lead to cooperation, further cooperation, or at least less tension in certain fields. The EU and Norway had bilateral contacts on the question of Norwegian gas supplies to the European Union and the price that the Norwegians are charging for it. There are a lot of opportunities, those are just two examples of the fact that you've got everybody together in the same place for and at the same time to have spin-off bilateral meetings, helping the network of European countries, of largely democratic European countries to work together and to come together. It's an opportunity to discuss, especially as it goes on meeting regularly, to discuss those European subjects which are unavoidably wider than just the European Union. Pipeline, electricity networks across borders, gas pipelines, oil pipelines, how to handle sanctions and sanction regimes, how to deal with migration problems if there is a surge of migration coming to Europe from Ukraine or from North Africa or from the Middle East. These things, by their nature, affect both EU and non-EU countries, and it's an opportunity to discuss those things together. Not to take legally binding decisions, as I said, it's not got the competences that the EU has, the powers that the EU has to do that, but it at least is a forum in which those things can be discussed. That, I think, sums up what it is. We will see how it evolves over the next few years. But it's clearly no substitute for being a member of the European Union. The Western Balkan countries, Ukraine, Moldova, don't see it as anything like that, nor should pro-Europeans in Britain. It's not a substitute. It gets us into the same room as other European countries and the EU leadership. Yes, fine, but it's no substitute for being part of, or at least having a closer relationship with the EU. The UK, if it wants to be serious about discussing security matters, how to handle Russia, how to deal with the Ukraine, how to coordinate sanctions and so on with the European Union, the UK should at the very least go through with what had in principle been agreed in the political declaration that was annexed to the withdrawal agreement, the agreement that was duly ratified by the House of Commons and Lords, by the British Parliament and by the European Parliament, which committed both sides after Brexit to negotiate, in the context of their future cooperation, a security partnership. And that security partnership, what was envisaged, it's there black on white if you want to look it up, was that the UK and the EU would cooperate on things like sanctions with third countries. That would have been pretty handy given what's happened in Ukraine and the sanctions being taken against Russia, to cooperate on other foreign and security policy issues. It's even envisaged that British ministers would attend meetings of the Council of Ministers of the European Union where warranted for this purpose. Both sides had committed to that. But after the withdrawal agreement was ratified by both sides, and it then came to negotiating the future relationship, what is now called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, Boris Johnson reneged on that. Although it had been approved by the House of Commons, he put it to one side and refused to negotiate that partnership agreement. Well, at the very least Britain could do, if it wants to be serious about developing its relations and coordination with the EU on dealing with Russia, helping Ukraine, coordinating on sanctions, aid to Ukraine, welcoming Ukrainian refugees, and all those practical issues, would be to do what it had agreed to do in the first place and revive such an agreement. Even that, as we know in this context, in this room, is no substitute itself for rejoining the EU. But that, of course, is another debate. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Richard. So, got a nice lot of people. Questions specifically on that, and do you mind taking broader questions, Richard, obviously on your expertise? And I'm sure many of us will be pondering about rejoining and whether anybody abroad still loves us and that sort of thing. I think we know some of the answers, but you probably know better than most of us. Okay, anyone got the hand up for a question, if they can do it in the normal electronic way? Can't see any hands. Anyone got a question? Okay, well, while people are thinking, I'll just ask the question that does get asked, and it's obviously, I appreciate from Richard, it's going to be his personal opinion, but if suddenly we had a total change of heart politically, and it was realised that our interests would be served to rejoin the EU, how would that approach best be played, and what would be the reaction to it, Richard?
And the reaction of other European countries would be positive, provided they had some reassurance that they wouldn't be put through the whole saga yet again in a few years' time down the road. So if, for instance, the next government were to apply to rejoin, they would be a bit concerned if the opposition party, presumably the Conservatives, though the way opinion polls are at the moment, they might not even be the main opposition party, so who knows. But if the Conservative Party was saying, if we've rejoined and we come back to government, we'll take Britain out again, that would be a powerful disincentive. So a bipartisan change of heart would be better. Or alternatively, if, for instance, though I'm opening a different debate here, if Britain were to adopt proportional representation to make it somewhat less likely that there would ever be a Conservative majority government elected on 40% of the vote that would take Britain out of the EU after we'd rejoined it, anything like that would reassure the European Union. But provided that were the case, if it's seen as a genuine change of heart that's not likely to be reversed in the following few years, then the EU would be pleased that Britain wants to join again. Brexit's not good for the EU either. It's lost a member state for the first time in its history, a significant one. the whole point of the European Union is to manage our interdependencies. That applies to a major country like Britain that is part of Europe, whether we like it or not, trades with Europe, is environmentally interdependent with Europe, ecologically, and in all kinds of ways. So from the European Union's perspective, the whole point of the European Union is to have a place that brings all the countries of Europe together. So saying no to one of them completely is not in their nature. In principle, they would welcome it. And we do still have a lot of friends. There's friends of the UK group in the European Parliament. There are quite a few MEPs still in the European Parliament who are dual nationals, who have British nationality. There's lots of ties, and all that would mean that they would welcome a British application to rejoin. That being said, it would need an accession treaty ratified by every member state. That might throw up some tricky subjects. You know, Spain might say, yes, great to have you back. Let's just sort out this question of Gibraltar a little bit before you join, or other bilateral things. You can imagine quite a few. So it's not necessarily a completely smooth path, but broadly speaking, it is something that our European friends would welcome if it's a genuine change of heart.
Thank you. Chris.
Thanks very much. Can I just start off with a tribute to Richard, because we shared a platform at the University of York during the Brexit referendum, and over the years, I hope you are going to get a medal or a sainthood of something for the massive contribution you've made over the years to try and maintain good relationships with our European partners. You've been absolutely phenomenal on that front. I know you like shooting from the hip. My question's about Scotland. Scotland wants to leave the UK and join the EU. Does that put you in a difficult position in deciding what your views are on that initiative?
Well, thank you first for your kind words. I don't think anybody's going to make me a saint, but Her late Majesty the Queen did give me a CBE in one of her last honours lists for European parliamentary activities, I think it was described as. So at least there was some acknowledgement, not so much of my role. I think it was symbolic of the work of all the constructive British MEPs, and there was always a majority of constructive British MEPs in the European Parliament, so it was a tribute to all of them, really. Now, on Scotland, without getting into the debate whether Scotland should be independent or not, certainly it's understandable that the SNP wants to use this as a campaigning issue and say, look, we voted to stay in the UK at the time because one of the arguments used was if you leave the UK, you'll be leaving the European Union as well. You'll be totally isolated, huge problems, etc. So we vote to stay in the UK, and then the UK drags us out. Of course, the SNP is going to exploit that. Whether that altogether makes a sufficient case for Scottish independence, it's up to the Scottish people ultimately, in due course, to judge. But if an independent Scotland then wants to join the EU, yes, again, I think the EU would accept such an application. There are some hesitations in countries like Spain, which don't want to make it a nice, easy precedent for instance, Catalonia to leave Spain and then rejoin the EU. But the Spanish government's always been very careful to say that the legal situations are very different between Catalonia and Scotland, because they want to. Well, they've got various reasons for arguing that anyway. So I suppose if it happens, then there's a lot of ifs in this. If there's a new referendum, if Scotland votes for independence, if eventually all that happens, then they apply to join the EU. Yes, the EU would, I should imagine, get around to welcoming such an application, and then you get down to discussing the nuts and bolts of fishing policy, of whether Scotland joins the euro, of other problems, and you recreate the issues that we've been dealing with on the Northern Ireland border across the border between England and Scotland. If that becomes a customs border, if the rest of the UK or England has not rejoined this customs union or the single market by then you're creating an external border of the European Union going from Berwick to Carlisle. So there's quite a few tricky issues to discuss when it comes to the practical details.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. First of all, thanks, Richard. Thanks for the share once again. It's always good to see you. I have two questions, please. The first question is about the 2016 referendum, right? There are questions regarding the legality of the referendum and also the issues surrounding that. There were investigations. Recently I've seen investigations going about. So where does that lead to? And the second question is, has Russia interfered with the referendum in 2016? I mean, this is the biggest question. The Russian report is still yet to be published. So I'm very keen to know what's going on behind the scenes, please. Thanks.
Well, there appears to be some evidence of Russian interference, and there's plenty of evidence of other things that were done in that referendum campaign by the Leave side, which broke the rules on finance and on other things, let alone the arguments they used, which were, of course, a pack of lies, but simply in campaigning terms. The problem we face, however, is that legally, that was just an advisory referendum. It was not taking a decision formally that could be overturned in the courts if you provide sufficient evidence of it not being run properly. The problem is that it was taken as politically binding by the government, by Parliament, and eventually, and so on. And a lot of politicians said we will abide by that referendum result, even if they had campaigned to remain. David Cameron as Prime Minister, Theresa May, who succeeded him as Prime Minister, said we take this as a politically binding mandate. But in terms of challenging it legally, there's not much you can do. That doesn't mean, though, you can't use it as part of our political arguments. I think it's important to say that this was a narrow result on a dubious franchise as well, because they remember that most British people living in other European countries couldn't vote. EU citizens living in Britain couldn't vote. Commonwealth citizens living in Britain, even if they were from Rwanda, which had only joined the Commonwealth a couple of years before, they could vote. 16, 17 years old people could not vote. They were entitled to vote in the Scottish independence referendum a few years before that, because this was supposed to be a long-term decision affecting their future. Well, that surely should have applied here. So there's all those questions. But it's also worth reminding people that the campaign techniques used were dubious. The money rules were broken, the expenditure rules and so on were broken, and there was a lot wrong with that campaign. And it's I think one of the arguments, not the only one, to throw in when you're having a serious discussion about how we got to where we are.
Thank you. Barbara, you'll have to unmute.
I am. I've just unmuted. I'm going to do two questions as well, please. One is, Richard, what did you think the UK wanted to get out of this meeting, since the Tories are so Europhobic? And the second one was, given the collapse of the Tory party at the moment, and we hope the collapse of Brexit, and you, I believe, were at the Labour Party conference with the European movement, how are we going to push Labour into being more pro-EU, or are they already?
Okay, first question, why did Truss go to the meeting? I think it became increasingly difficult for her not to, once just about every other democratic country in Europe, or even semi-democratic, was there. it was not just the EU, it was not just the EU plus applicant states, it was also Norway, Switzerland, who are not applying to join the European Union, Turkey, who's not likely to join the European Union in any time in the foreseeable future. And it would have looked rather odd for Britain not to participate. On your second question on Labour, the Labour leadership is very cautious, shall we say. At the fringe meetings at Labour Party conference, there were quite a lot on Europe and on Brexit, organised by the Labour Movement for Europe, Labour for European Future, Another Europe is Possible, the Party of European Socialists, the Labour Party Irish Society, and indeed others. They were all rather well attended. And the debates showed that a large number of party members don't share the caution of the party leadership and would at the very least like to see commitments to realigning with the single market, rejoining, well, actually, to be fair, the leadership has more or less said rejoin the research programs and Erasmus student exchange scheme and things like that, but to be a little bit more positive about it. And there's also quite a lot who would actually want Labour to pledge to rejoin. That's probably not a majority, and that's mainly for tactical reasons. The leadership is so worried about the minority of, in my view, it's unduly trying to placate the minority and the shrinking number of Labour Leave voters and risks alienating the larger and growing number of potential Labour voters who are critical of Brexit. And that debate is very much alive, shall we say, in the Labour Party. Now, one thing worth hammering home in the Labour Party, but I think in other parties as well, is the trend in public opinion. There was a very good speaker at a fringe meeting in Liverpool, Professor Bentel from Sheffield University, who's a psychologist, clinical psychologist by training. And then it's quite funny, he said, after a few years, I began specializing in schizophrenia. I noticed that a lot of politicians shared the same symptoms. So he switched to discussing political psychology, why people vote in certain ways, why they have entrenched views that they won't change, or what are the circumstances in which they will change, how identities are formed, become entrenched and dissolve. And he made a number of telling points about Brexit, but he said the key statistic to watch is this opinion poll on, do you think Brexit was the right thing to do or was a mistake? And he says, whereas most opinion polls on political parties, how will you vote, that sort of thing, go up and down month after month in function of events, this poll has shown a slow, gradual, but steadily continuing increase in the number of people saying Brexit was a mistake, now reaching nearly 60%. There was even an opinion poll with the majority saying let's rejoin, which is another threshold. But the fact he was saying that this is so steady and relentlessly going up means it's a deep-seated shift in opinion. Now, if that trend continues, then it should be a lot easier for the leadership of the Labour Party, or indeed some other parties, to start being a little bit more, a little bit less cautious about this and actually come out and say, yes, we should at the very least join the customs union, single market alignment, and even consider rejoining. That, I think, is something we have to hammer home. Public opinion has shifted this way, even without any major politician going out saying Brexit's a bloody disaster, we've got to reconsider it, we've got to revisit this. And British public opinion does historically sometimes go completely against go completely the other way from something that it initially supported enthusiastically, and Brexit was never enthusiastic. But think back to Suez, think more recently to Iraq, think historically of the Munich agreements. All these things were overwhelmingly popular initially in public opinion. Nowadays, nobody defends any of them. So if we can get to that point with Brexit by hammering home the problems it causes, the fact it bears no resemblance to what was promised, and all the arguments that you, for Europe, I'm sure, use all the time, and accentuate that shift in public opinion, then it becomes much more feasible for Labour and indeed others to take a more courageous position.
Thank you. Just a couple of tiny points from me personally. Just to say, obviously, I link with a lot of Remainers in the course of chairing York for Europe. And I have heard people, firstly, there's I won't say a lot, but a worthwhile number of ex-Labour Party members amongst our rank. And I think there's 4 tuned in tonight of our audience who used to be not just tick the Labour box, actively out on the street doing things for Labour, who no longer are, because we are predominantly Europeans and secondly socialists, and it's a great dilemma for us all. And the other thing that sort of links with that really is, I've also said, you know, we were out on the streets not so long ago, advocating culture, music, friendship, acknowledging that Europe's still there. We sometimes feel we're doing what a decent opposition should be doing. We don't see Labour flags out doing very much, and that's not to, nor the Lib Dems. This isn't a party political thing at all. I know there are the reasons that you state, but it is quite, well, it spurs us on to do things, but we sometimes wish that the visible pro-Europeans weren't quite so lonely among our politicians, and of both parties, really, both major opposition parties. I throw that in for free. I feel better for saying that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point, but I would encourage people who are inclined to be in the Labour Party, or indeed in other parties, to be active in those parties, not opt out of them, because they are an important battleground in terms of the European arguments, and you influence them much more from the inside than outside. By the way, the Labour Movement for Europe, the officially affiliated socialist society that's affiliated to the Labour Party, has had a huge increase in its membership over recent times, and that's continuing, a bit like the European movement on a cross-party basis, but that's an encouraging sign.
Thank you for that. Right, I suspect that our friend Sean will talk more about the democratic process. Sean, over to you.
Oh, hello. Yes, hello, Richard. And I've got a sort of question with my sort of Make Votes Matter hat on, which is related to the whole issue of rejoin EU as well. I was glad to hear you recognise that the adoption of PR for House of Commons elections would indeed make it virtually impossible for a Brexit supporting Conservative government to be re-elected on a minority of the votes with a House of Commons majority. Given that, would you agree that PR would be an essential first step, if not the only step by any means, an essential first step towards single market and customs union membership and ultimately rejoin EU? And if so, what prospect do you think there would be for the Labour Party actually accepting its own conference policy on PR at the last conference and implementing that as a manifesto commitment for the first term of a Labour-led government?
Well, as I said earlier, I think proportional representation would be extremely helpful. I wouldn't say it's the necessary first step, that you can't do anything without having first done that step, because that might preclude us from doing other things which, if the opportunity arises, we should do. But it would be a good thing. The Labour conference coming out in support by a large majority of the resolution, which explicitly said a commitment to proportional representation should be included in the next manifesto, is not technically binding, because the manifesto is drawn up by a joint committee, a joint meeting of the National Executive and the Shadow Cabinet. But it puts a pretty hefty political momentum in that direction. And inside the Labour Party, there are plenty of people who are determined to keep up the pressure on that, to make it very difficult to not to do that. And final point on why this is important from the European point of view, we should never forget that the last general election, where Boris Johnson supposedly won this landslide, that was on 43% of the vote, whereas 53% had voted for parties who were by that time demanding a new referendum.
Yeah, or were committed to rejoin. So yeah, certainly. And given all that, do you have any personal insights as to what Keir Starmer's position actually is?
I alluded to his cautious nature earlier, and I suppose there are perhaps a number of subjects to which that applies.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Richard Wilson of Leeds has just posted something I'd like him to share, because it's relevant to what we're saying. Richard, jump the queue, please, briefly.
Yeah, sorry, I mean, I'm just keeping an eye on my Twitter feed.
No, tell us, it's good.
Just saw that Tobias Elwood on Channel 4 News has quite openly said that Brexit isn't working, and that it's time to talk about joining the European single market, the EU single market, which is, exactly what we want to see, is that the conversion of this crisis that we've seen over the past month in the government to the breaking realization that Brexit is a major underlying cause of all of this mess. And if the Conservatives can start to recognise that, and the media, then we have a chance, don't we? So very encouraging, and I think it's something we need to all as campaigners push on, is this connection between the current chaos economy in our country and Brexit, and how we've got solutions ahead of us, as Richard has spoken about, that are there on a plate for us. And I really think the door needs to be pushed open now for this.
Thank you, Richard. It's time for me to say we're running a coach from York, as most of you will be bored of hearing, and we've still got some places, and even 2 or 3 free ones, sponsored ones by generous people for those who couldn't manage the money. It's still time to come. Sean, did you finish, and did I rudely interrupt you? Sean Hagan, did you want?
That's.
You've gone off, can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Better be back again now.
Yeah, that's fine. There's plenty of other people with hands up. So
okay, Peter Jarman, nice to see you again, sir. Come in, please.
Thank you. I very much appreciated all the service of Richard over many years representing us in the European Parliament. He has said that the European political community has a membership that is very similar to that of the Council of Europe. Have I understood, however, that one of the main purposes of this new community is to give heads of states an opportunity to meet each other, not only together, but often in pairs, but not to make any formal decisions, but to have come to some kind of agreements, whereas the Council of Europe is not normally attended by heads of states, as I understand it. It's often very much in the background. You feel that somehow these two entities, these two organizations complement each other, or is it the case that really the Council of Europe is rather restricted to looking at just human rights?
Well, the Council of Europe has historically had 3 meetings at the level of heads of state or government. And so if this had been done in the framework of the Council of Europe, that would have been a 4th time. There's no reason for it not to be. And it's there, it's got staff, it's got infrastructure, it's got interpretation facilities, it's got all the paraphernalia you need. So I think the Council of Europe people were a bit put out that it was done in a separate framework, given that in the end it's the same membership that's gone along just about.
Okay. Simon, sir.
Yeah, Richard, thanks for this session. It's really, really interesting. Yeah, you've already addressed the questions I had relating to the UK, but I'm interested in the wider perspective. What do you think about the possibility of countries such as Ukraine and Moldova joining the EU, which were part of the former Soviet Union?
Thank you.
Well, they've applied and they've been accepted as candidates. It's going to be some time before they are ready, even if the conflict ends. Let's hope it does. But in terms of being ready to join economically, in terms of the proper functioning of the rule of law in Ukraine and Moldova, which has also applied, it's some way away. Even the Western Balkan countries, some of whom have started negotiations since a couple of years, are still, since a few years in some cases, are still some way of being ready to join. By the way, it wouldn't be the first time that former parts of the Soviet Union have joined the European Union, because, of course, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania used to be Soviet socialist republics in the Soviet Union. So, and that enlargement went quite well, really, to the Baltic states. That's working quite well. The EU would have to address the issues of how it works if it were going to suddenly become a European Union of 35 or so countries. And there are still some subjects, including foreign policy, the adoption of sanctions, and a few other important things, where decisions require unanimity in the Council. The Council with ministers from each country. The Parliament, European Parliament, votes by a majority, fine, but when the matter has to go before the Council, those subjects that need unanimity, it's difficult enough now, but if it's enlarged to 30-odd countries, it risks paralysing the EU. So the EU itself would have to bring in further reforms to enable the enlargement to be a success.
Thank you.
Also, there would be opposition from Russia, obviously.
Yeah, but Russia's not a member state, so it doesn't have a veto.
No, I agree, but politically,
yeah, politically, yeah. Well, they weren't really happy when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined. And they're not happy now that Finland and Sweden have joined or are in the process of joining NATO. But yeah.
Right, we've got Roger's question that he's been holding on patiently. We've probably got time for a couple more on top of that. If anybody has any, we're running out of time. It's flown. So if anybody wants to ask a further question of Richard, it's time to put your hand up. So Roger, sir, carry on.
Hello, thank you, Richard, for your contribution. I hope you can hear me. My question is about the position of the Labour Party, because I have to be honest, I've struggled. I don't believe that I've ever heard a coherent left-wing argument in favour of Brexit. I thought socialism and all points left was supposed to be internationalist. And whenever I hear someone from the political left seeking to advocate or support Brexit, they always seem to be coming out with arguments that don't seem very left-wing to me.
Well, I would tend to agree with you. There was historically, as you know, the opposition of Tony Benn and others on the left of the Labour Party to Britain joining the European Union, with a mixture of arguments about the terms that had been negotiated at the time, which were quite difficult for some sectors in the British economy, and the argument that this was just a free-for-all market, that therefore market rules, neoliberal type rules applied and made socialists policies and intervention in the economy more difficult. Those arguments, though, I think are no longer valid, because in the intervening period, the single market, which is the most important creation aspect of the EU, if you like, the world's largest market, it's a market with rules to protect consumers, rules to protect workers, rules to protect the environment, and you can do all that much more effectively at the level, at the European level than you can do at national level, by having common standards and common rules. And a lot of that left critique of the European Union has therefore faded away, but not entirely. There are still a few dinosaurs like Ian Lavery who still think that way.
Okay, any other questions? Right, no need to fill time for the sake of it. Richard, have you got a last sort of closing address or paragraph or some thoughts we should take on our way? And I normally ask our speakers the same question. I'm not sure it applies to you, but answer it if you like, is how can we help you and your cause? I think we're trying to do that anyway, broadly. Anyway, have a few words with us and then we'll say good night.
No, I just say keep up the good work, keep going. You know, the arguments, the cause is a noble one, the arguments are right. Circumstances are changing now and more people are listening to the sort of things that we're saying. Brexit was bad for Britain. It's never too late to rectify a mistake, and we should be the outriders as European movement, as Grassroots for Europe and all the other pro-European organizations shouldn't be too cautious in speaking out. Somebody has to speak out. The leaderships of none of the parties are doing it. So be the outriders, push, and then others will perhaps follow our leadership.
Thank you very much. Anyway, I hope we meet again soon, Richard, and all the very best in all your various ventures, and I hope to see you back in the European Parliament soon.
Thank you. Yeah.
On behalf of all of us, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.